Okay, so I am Paolo Viscardi. I'm the curator at the Grant Museum of Zoology, and I'm the chair of the Natural Sciences Collections Association. So I'm going to be looking at this from a very different perspective, or a slightly different perspective, because I'm representing people, and I myself do not go out in the field and collect, because I manage a museum where I have specimens of every possible type of zoological origin, and frankly, I'm not a specialist in any of them. We can't afford to be. And there's a lot of museums around the country which are in that sort of state. So what I'm going to be looking at is how the implications of Nagoya are actually going to affect those collections for people like me and from some of the others in the audience that I know. And it's kind of scary when it first, when Nagoya first came out. I think everyone was scared when it first came out because no one knew what was actually entailed. And what we are concerned about as natural science collections is we have genetic resources by the hundreds of thousands or millions. They're sitting there locked away in stores or out on display, and they've been collected over 100 years. So when the first kind of trickles of Nagoya started to come out, everyone was terrified that we'd have to worry about ensuring that every single historical specimen in our collections would be properly traceable back to the origin, and that we had agreements that they could be used by researchers. And obviously, that's not an issue, because we only need to worry about things that were collected since October 12th in 2014. We don't have to worry about anything before that, which is something which I can't reiterate often enough to the people in the natural sciences community. They don't need to worry about the old stuff. It's only new things that are coming in now that they need to really worry about. Okay, that I just really wanted to make that clear. So the collections that we're dealing with, this is actually something I stole from one of Chris's slides from a previous talk. These are the sorts of things that collections are required to actually do to comply with national regulations when the staff are collecting. And some museums do continue active collecting overseas, and the NHM being a great example, obviously, but that's why they've got people like Chris working hard to make sure they understand what's going on. You need to be sure you can legally receive material. Now, obviously, in order to do that, we need to know what the law is. We need to make sure we can carry out research legally. We need to be compliant with conditions of access. We need to make sure we share any benefits as agreed, which means we need to understand what's going on with contracts and permits. And the thing is that with natural science collections that aren't being kind of created by collectors, but are being populated by other people, other researchers, so going out into the field, collecting specimens, and then bringing them back, and then lodging them in museums. That means that we don't have direct control over what's going on with those discussions about how these contracts and these permits are actually being processed. And certainly, we don't really understand what's going on in terms of the benefits that are being agreed, unless we ask for that information. And obviously, there are elements of reporting. So if we're holding these specimens, then the onus I'm expecting here, I'm not 100% sure, I'm going to keep looking down at China and Chris. I'm assuming that if we're holding those specimens and then they are getting used by researchers who come to our facility, effectively that means that we will have reporting obligations about them being used. So this is effectively the same questions, but just turned around. So this is what we as a sector, the museum sector, needs to think about. We need to think about getting clear information about national regulations and legislation. That's one of the reasons I'm here. That's one of the reasons I've been listening to people like Chris in China and trying to keep an ear on basically what's going on. We're all learning new things all the time. None of us are experts in this, except, well, I'm going to look down there, but would you consider yourselves experts? Yeah. And therefore, basically, Chris and China are the people that we all look to. Does anyone else consider themselves an expert in this area? Who would feel happy for people to come over and ask them questions and feel confident they could answer? No, exactly. And this is why people like Chris and China are so important to all the rest of us. And that's why it's great that we're having this session here today, because it provides us with an opportunity to pick the brains of the experts. So hopefully I'm a bit clearer about what these regulations and legislation are actually about. What we do know is that there is more information going to be coming online constantly. I'm assuming, anyway, I'm hoping, how things like Brexit are going to impact on that, because it will have an impact. I don't know. but we will find out. The main thing is that we need to know things. We need to know the requirements for legally receiving material. So, as it is, we have to go through a lot of steps before acquiring objects. It's just part of the process, and I'll talk about that in a minute. We need to make sure we know how research is being conducted legally. We think we know, but some organisations will be better informed than others, and it means that we need to have some sort of training in place, and that might be delivered by organisations like the Linnean Society, it might be organisations like NATSCA, it could be the Natural History Museum laying on this sort of training, but the training needs to exist. There's a need for that training, otherwise people are not going to know what they're doing, and that's obviously a recipe for disaster. And the main thing is we need to really know what the conditions of access are going to be, because that's how collections are used. People come to us to use the material that we hold. That's why we exist. That's part of our function in life. And if we can't do that effectively, if we're not able to do it legally, then we have some serious problems. And obviously, being aware of the benefits, being aware of contracts and permits, we need copies of these sorts of things when we acquire specimens from collectors. And the main thing is really understanding what the reporting requirements are. Does anyone really know what the reporting requirements are from the perspective of collections? Well, that's the reason why I asked Chris a question earlier about registered collections. There aren't any at the moment, as far as we're aware, so we don't know what the reporting obligations are like. We don't know these things, but the trouble is that right now, I'm sure there is a museum somewhere where there's a researcher who's just got back off some real field work, who's asking them if they want to take these insects they collected while they were in South Africa or something. And if they haven't if they haven't actually got this information, they cannot legally take those specimens because they won't know what to do with them to make sure they're conforming to the law. So this is a screenshot from a website which has appeared in 3 of the talks today, 4, and this is the 4th. This is a very, very useful website. It has lots of information. I took the screenshot recently, so there's a little number. Hang on, I think there's a... Oh, no, that was where I make it invisible. There's a little number there. That was 3 on Chris's. It's 4 now, so there's more things happening. So this is being updated regularly. So this is actually a really useful site, and that's the clearinghouse for the ABS. Very, very useful, and you can track down the information just for Britain or for other countries. So actually, I found this useful already. I've had specimens offered to me by a researcher recently, and I was able to go and check on there to see what the status of the country of origin of those specimens was. Very simple. It wasn't one of the. It wasn't signed up to the protocol. It wasn't a ratified member, so didn't worry about it too much. But still need to be aware of it, and you still need to make sure that you've got as much of the information available as possible for when the collector went and collected, which is a nightmare, frankly. When I say there are lots of collections out there, a lot of small collections, and this is a map of collections in the UK. This is from the NATSCA Natural History Near You site. All of these are sites in the UK and Ireland which hold natural history collections. Okay, there are in total about 400 on there, and there are certainly some which haven't quite made it on here yet. Some of these collections will be very small and maybe in a school and maybe they're not active. Others are, the Natural History Museum or the National Museum of Wales. There are a huge range of different sized organisations. Some of them have no staff. Some of them have no professional collection staff. Generally, in those instances, they won't be accepting collections. However, there are certainly quite a lot of museums on that map where they might have one member of curatorial staff or maybe even one collections manager who has no expertise in natural history but will still be having to deal with people from members of the public or from universities or other researchers coming in and offering them specimens and having to deal with it. So this is the kind of scale of the problem of where we need to get information out to about the Nagoya Protocol to make sure that we are, as a nation, in a position to conform to the requirements. And I think the point was raised earlier. This is about reputation. And that's not just institutional reputation and individual personal reputation. It's about the reputation of us as a nation trying to make sure we're doing the right things. So once these things get into collections, there are 3 main things that we need to worry about. We need to record what's coming in, which basically means understanding what the benefits that have been agreed are, making sure we understand what any contracts have been put in place, make sure we know what permits have been put in place. The trouble is that when we get specimens into the collection, we don't necessarily know how they're ever going to get used by someone in the future, because people will come in, take a look, and ask if they can use it for a project they have in mind. So immediately, that means that any of the benefits that have already been agreed will probably not already have been agreed to. They would have been collected for one thing. That doesn't mean that they can be used for something else. That will need to be renegotiated. This will come back into reporting as well, but the biggest issue for museums is the need to track the specimens and the use of the specimens. So at the moment, we deal with lots and lots of little bits of legislation with our collections. We deal with things like CITES, be it individual CITES, Article 10, certificates for particular specimens, be it Article 30s or 60s if you're going back. Sorry, 30s if you're going back, 60s if you're talking about now. Basically dealing with the whole of the collection. We could be dealing with some Home Office licences, either for taxidermy or for just holding species from the UK that are covered in the EU Habitats Directive. There are egg licences that some collections hold, and there's the Human Tissue Act, so we have to make sure we conform to the licensing for that. There are loads of licences out there, lots of little licences for all sorts of little things that you wouldn't necessarily expect, you know, asbestos and radioactive materials and all sorts of things that come up in natural science collections, because of course we have geology as well. But with the professionalisation of museums over the last couple of decades, actually we're not necessarily in a bad position to keep track of these things. Things like designation and accreditation in particular. Accreditation is what the Arts Council is currently managing, which basically says that you're a proper museum. If you can conform to the requirements of accreditation, you are recognised as a proper museum, and therefore you can call yourself a museum and do all the museum-y things like get specimens given to you that you can hold in trust for people to use for research and so on. There are also things like the MA Code of Ethics. There's the Collections Trust providing guidelines, which often interweave with what the Arts Council are doing through the accreditation. And there are subject specialist networks like NATSCA and so on. Now, all of these organisations that exist, they're providing guidance, they're providing ideas, they're providing thoughts. One of the big issues is that Nagoya isn't even mentioned by any of these organisations in any kind of informative way. I searched on the Collections Trust, which is a great place to look for information for museums. Nagoya is not even mentioned anywhere on their website and any of their documents. It's as if it doesn't exist. And this is a problem because, as I said before, there are collections out there where there are no natural scientists, and there are lots of natural scientists out there who don't really understand what Nagoya is about, and they haven't really engaged with it because they don't think it applies to them, because they don't go out in the field and collect. Unfortunately, that's not the case. One of the problems we've had is that when we don't know what we're supposed to do because there's any kind of fuzziness in guidance, we don't do anything. So that certainly was a situation with bird eggs for quite a long time. You could walk into pretty much any room full of natural history curators and just mention bird eggs to them, and they will turn a bit pale and probably walk away, or maybe rant at you about the lack of any clear guidance on what you're supposed to do with bird eggs. That's actually become a bit clearer recently. There's been some changes in the law, so that's great. But the problem is when you don't know what to do, you do the wrong thing, which is not do anything, or you basically sweep it under the carpet and you hide it. Because basically in 20 years' time, who's going to remember and the law will have changed? Which is pretty much the attitude a lot of natural science curators have, because that's literally what the situation is. One of the good things that we do have are sets of guidance and accreditation, this idea that we need to be recognised as being a proper institution. One of the things we have to is conform to spectrum standards for documentation. And this is really where I think Nagoya needs to fit within the kind of museum side of things. This is where it makes sense to have some guidance, at least some ideas, because accreditation is something you have to apply for every 3 years. It's a process you have to go through. You have to apply for accreditation. Even if you've already got it, doesn't matter how big the organisation is, you still need to reapply for your accreditation every 3 years. And it means that you have to go through all of your policies, your procedures, and all your protocols, and make sure that they're all sound and they're in place and they've been lodged with the Arts Council. And that provides us a really good opportunity in the documentation side of things to have a little line added in the, I think in the field collection part of Spectrum, to make sure that Nagoya is being acknowledged. So at the moment there's a bunch of information there about due diligence and making sure that there's evidence of CITES for the specimens. And I think that a simple addition would be to add information about benefit sharing agreements and other key documentation relating to implementation of the Nagoya Protocol for specimens collected after the 12th of October, I should say 2014. Now, one of the issues for natural science collections is that tracking use is difficult. This is a lovely old drawer of insects. Can you see any labels there? You might see some tiny little numbers. Basically, tracking use is difficult. We might have a beautiful collection of insects that turn up from West Africa, and they may have lovely field notebooks, but the actual individual specimens might have very little information associated with them as specimens. Sometimes you'll get a drawer of moths, and there'll be one kind of entry on a notebook describing the whole of that collecting, and that's all you're ever going to get. So you don't know where the individual moths were collected. They might be collected from various different parts of West Africa, not necessarily just one country. You might be dealing with collections which you have no idea when they were collected. So they may have been collected 100 years ago. They may have been collected last week. Generally, you'll be able to tell if they're 100 years old compared to collected last week. But actually, when you start getting to more recent collecting, if they were collected in 1990s compared to today, sometimes you can really, really struggle. And as time goes on, it's going to get more and more difficult to understand where the lines are drawn. At the moment, it's great because, really, unless something was collected quite, really, really up to that kind of border point, it's new, it's fine. We know if anything comes in now and it's fresh, it's fine. Things, 10 years' time, how are we going to know where that cut-off point for when the Nagoya Protocol actually started to come into force for the collections is actually going to be applicable to the specimens that we're getting in? If someone's a bit fuzzy about when they collected the material, did they collect it in 2014 or 2013? We can't remember. How do you track down that information? How do you make sure that you are complying with the law? And how do you make sure you can track it back to its source? This is a major problem that we have with natural science collections. And the trouble is that we like to think that we're really much better at doing all this stuff than we used to be. And that is true. And that's one of the good things about things like spectrum standards. We impose standards on these things. However, when you get a collection that turns up on your doorstep at short notice as a bequest from someone who's just died, it's got some important material in it. You don't want to say no, but you don't have any staff to process it. What you end up doing is basically taking the material, and it sits there for a long time before anyone actually deals with it. And this is a problem, and it's one that we already face. We already have difficulty tracking things. Just to give you an example of the sorts of things that happen in natural science collections, these are some new species, relatively new, described in the last couple of years. There's a lovely little quote here by Michael Rossello. Basically, museum collections will likely become an increasingly important in maintaining a source of study specimens, a repository for genetic resources of imperiled and extinct taxa. That's all fine. And it's the kind of thing which we exist for. There are new species being described from museums every day. And the trouble is that when we get new specimens in, there's a very good chance that the lack of people to work on the specimens means that they will not be addressed for a long time. And it's not about neglect, and it's not about not having the right kind of technology at the moment. It's simply about people not having the opportunity to do the work on the specimens because there's so many of them, and there's so few people, and there's so many other priorities. So one of the things which turned up, this lovely, the sparkle-winged damselfly, beautiful specimen. This is from a paper where 60 new species were described. No, there's a bunch of species in there. But 60 new species have been described this century. Museum specimens over 30 years old were studied for 1 in 3. Okay, so 1 in 3 of the new species discovered in the last century have been found from museum specimens, and the oldest of those was collected in 1899. Just to give you an idea about the lag time that there can be between the discovery and the collection of a specimen and it actually being described. Okay. Right now, this isn't a major problem for things like Nagoya, but if you're working in a museum, it will be. In 20, 30, 40, 100 years' time, we still need to know where that specimen was collected and what the benefit agreements were. And making sure that those things link together is going to be a serious issue because documentation systems change, the way in which we can input data changes. Most of us now in museums have collections management databases where actually it should be relatively straightforward to make sure we have all the necessary documentation uploaded either in the notes field and then with an attached scan. But there's a massive assumption there because a lot of places still using paper records. They're still not actually having access to good digital information about their specimens. And even if you do, there are lots of occasions when you get people coming into the collections to use them for their research, and they will look at a huge number of specimens. They won't actually look at the database, they'll look at the specimens there in the drawer. And if they don't know what has and hasn't been collected with various different agreements on, then it's going to be very difficult to track the usage for those specimens. So at the moment, if people want to use a specimen that was collected 20 years ago, they come in, they take a look at the specimen, they'll decide whether or not it'll be useful for their research. If it's useful, then you'll let them research it. If they want to do something destructive, they'll have to fill in the forms. But all of that, and you might monitor that use on your collections database. But there is no you don't have to do that. Okay, that's an institutional decision about whether you monitor that usage. There's no obligation through spectrum standards to actually monitor the use of things for research, and there's no legal obligation. And so it's one of those things which tends to slip quite readily because everyone working in museums is, are increasingly overworked and understaffed. So I can see this being a serious issue in the future when people are basically going to say, take a look through that drawer, work out if there's anything you want to use. I'm going to go over here and do a bit of collections work here because I'm just going to stand here like a plum watching you work otherwise. That's not how it works. And we do need to find a way of making sure that specimens are able to convey the information. I mean, labels are great. If you've got something big, if you've got hippos and bears, and it's straightforward to tie a label on them with a very clear definition saying this is covered under this particular piece of paperwork in this drawer. If you've just got an insect with a tiny little label on it, you're not going to be able to do that. So whether it be barcoding, whether there's microchips stuck in the paper, who knows how we're going to do it in the future, but we need to find a way of doing that because managing that information is going to be very difficult if it's going to be done in a way which is actually practical for collections. And the other thing that I wanted to just think about, and this is more of a discussion than an actual piece of information I'm providing, but museum collections, they turn up, this is a lovely bat, it's a pickled bat, pickled fruit bat, great. And one of the things about collections like this is there's scope for serendipity. If you want to look at that, that's fine, you can look at it as a bat, but you can also sequence it, sequence the fluid it's in, and as has happened. And in one species of bat, you might find 55 viruses, 50 which might be new to science. And of those 50, there might be a couple in there which actually have some sort of benefits arising from their discovery and their working on them, research on them. If all you've done is catch that bat, and that's the only thing that you have any kind of agreement with the source country about, how do you track the use of the additional information, the associated information? That's tricky. And obviously it's going to come back down to contacting the source nation, actually making a new agreement for the use of that material. But the thing is you need to know that you have to do that. You need to know and understand how that would work, which again, there are ways around this. It's just raising it as an issue because I know the reality of the situation in most museums, it would not happen because it's so difficult to manage. The technology is there, even the willingness is there, the practicalities of working in a museum collection means it won't happen. As Chris said, there is a big draw on reporting. It takes a lot of staff time. It's a requirement, but it has to be done, and it's good that it's done. But the trouble is that it's one of those things that tends to slip to the bottom of the pile when you've got more pressing, you've got a flood in your store or whatever, which happens all the time. So it's one of these things that we do need to make sure that we have procedures and policies in place to make sure we can ensure we get the information transferred. And we can do that. And I'm just going to finish with talk about citation. Now, it's already been mentioned that the ethics and the agreements should be mentioned in any publications arising from research done on specimens which have been collected under the Nagoya, since Nagoya has been implemented. But I personally am of the opinion that collections should demand citation as a condition of their use, and that's a citation of the actual specimen use, so it can be tracked right back to the specimen, because once you've got the specimen, and if it is on a database, then you can track all the rest of the information around that. Authors need to be made aware of their benefit sharing obligations, and so that should come from both the publishers and the people providing collections for them. And journals should be requiring that specimens are properly cited. Because if the journals don't put the pressure on on authors to do that, authors won't do it, as a matter of course. Well, not all of them anyway. The good ones will. But there are a lot of people out there who just want to get it done, and all this extra stuff is something they don't want to have to do unless they have to. So I think that's something that needs to be done. And I think the Linnean Society and the publications in the LinSoc, actually they're very good about publishing the actual citations for the specimens. But it's something which I think could always be improved, and certainly it would be good to use them as a model for how it should be done with other publications. Okay, I'm going to stop there and just see if anyone's happy to have a chat about some of the things arising from that, because it's mainly about starting a conversation. Thank you.